Hello and welcome back to Virtual Classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is the Industrial Revolution Part 1. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those keywords at your left. You got it? All right, let's get started. Now, machines is the main theme of the Industrial Revolution. They are beginning to replace significant amounts of human and animal power that is going to be used in the production and manufacturing of goods. So what is the Industrial Revolution? Well, it's this process by which animal and human power is being replaced by machines. For instance, the use of the steam engine will be used to produce textiles beginning in about the 1780s, and this becomes kind of that turning point, the linchpin into what we call the Industrial Revolution, as Europe will begin to gradually transition from an agricultural and commercial society into a modern industrial society. As early as the late 1830s, only a small fraction of British people were working in the factories. But by the mid-19th century, industrialism had spread all across Europe. The economic changes that are characterized by the Industrial Revolution did more than any other movement in history to revolutionize life in Europe and Western civilization. In fact, you can make an argument that not since the development of agriculture during Neolithic age, during the Agricultural Revolution, had there been such a dramatic, rapid change in society. Now, to get ahead of myself. So let's talk about this process. Now, the roots of the Industrial Revolution start with the Commercial Revolution. This began around about 1500 to about 1700 CE, and it would spur great economic growth in Europe and will bring about the Age of Exploration. Along with that, the Price Revolution, or inflation, that will stimulate production as producers can get more money for their goods. The rise of capitalism increased the use of surplus money for investment and ventures to make a profit. And as we'll see, which takes place in every industrial revolution the world over, we also see the rise of a middle class that include new middle class businesses being started in the form of chartered companies and joint stock companies. And it's the scientific revolution that will produce the first wave of mechanical inventions and technological advances. Let me repeat that. The scientific revolution will produce the first wave of mechanical inventions and technological advances. And to correspond with this, with the price revolution, the commercial revolution, the capitalism, scientific revolution, we will see an increase in Europe's population that will provide larger markets. Now, it starts slow. Now, this does not start all at once. It starts quite incrementally. And it begins what we'll refer to as proto-industrialization. This begins in what's called the cottage industry. It has a very fascinating story behind it, which is that the rural industry became this major pillar of Europe's growth in industry. The rural population was eager to supplement their income from peasant farming. Merchants in cities were sought cheap rural labor rather than paying guild members in the towns and cities higher rates. And so manufacturing with hand tools in peasant cottages came to challenge urban industry. So let me get this straight here. Manufacturers, merchants in these cities who want to sell stuff, well, if they want to have someone make stuff for them to sell, they have to hire these guild members in cities. That's expensive because they work together to keep prices high as laborers. So they began to outsource the production process to the rural areas, and these peasant farmers were eager to supplement their income and created what was called the cottage industry, essentially doing cheap manual labor that was, ununionized, non-unionized, not a guild. And so these merchants would give raw materials, like raw wool, to a rural family who would then produce a finished or semi-finished product and then would send it back to the merchant in the city for payment. And these cottage merchants were not paid by the hour, but rather paid by the number of pieces they produced. The merchants would then sell the finished product for a profit. And again, the number one product, the most important product in this point in history, was wool cloth. And basically, this entire process, the cottage industry became a family affair. It was a family enterprise. 4 or 5 would be spinners, and they would need to keep the work of 4 or 5 spinners would be needed to keep one weaver employed steadily. The husband and wife constantly tried to find more thread and more spinners, and sometimes families would be subcontracted to work for other families. Now, the constant disputes between the cottagers and the merchants occurred over weight of material, the quality of the cloth, and, time delivered. The rural labor was unorganized and difficult for merchants to control. These merchant capitalists thus searched for more efficient methods of production, resulting in the growth of factories and the Industrial Revolution. It would also lead to the putting out system in England that later spread to other continental countries, including France and Germany. Now, what's important here also is just a little fun side fact, which is this is where we get the idea of spinsters, these women who were supposedly unmarried, but that they were working in this cottage industry. And so the old adage that, oh, you're nothing but an old spinster. Well, that had a very real roots because these women were able to make money for themselves in an age when most women could not do so by themselves without being married first. Oops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself there. Now, these constant disputes, however, are going to put an end to the cottage industry. And instead, what we'll see is the growth of new technology as these merchants sought more efficient means to be able to produce their goods. And what this leads to is what we'll refer to as proto-industrialization. And this is the result of numerous amounts of technology. Again, small technologies. First, in 1733, John Kay will develop a flying shuttle that will enable the weaver to throw the shuttle back and forth between threads with one hand. So rather than having to use both hands to be able to, weave the thread in and out, using the flying shuttle will allow them to work with one hand while the other hand is doing the weaving, thus enabling them to basically double production. Or in this case, one person only is needed to operate the loom. So you can have multiple looms, and 2 people can work 2 looms, doing the job of what usually was on one loom. A second advance in 1764 by James Hargreaves, he invents the spinning jenny, which will mechanize the spinning wheel. See, the hand operated was simple and inexpensive. These early models had between 6 and 24 spindles, mounted to a sliding carriage, with each spindle would spin thread. Usually they worked by a woman who moved the carriage back and forth with one hand and turning the wheel to supply power in the other. But by the use of the spinning jenny, that was a mechanized wheel, these spinners can now outpace the weavers, who were usually the husbands. Then in 1769, Richard Arkwright will produce the water frame that will further improve thread spinning. Several hundred spindles on a machine required water power. It required large, specialized factories that employed as many as 1,000 workers. They produced coarse, strong thread, which was then put out for respinning on hand-powered spinning jennies. And then finally in 1779, Samuel Crompton will invent the spinning mule, which will combine the best features of the spinning jenny and the water frame. In other words, he put them together. And this will result all in a cotton spinning gradually being done in factories rather than the old cottage system. Now, the first place to industrialize is England, and the results are dramatic. It begins about the 1780s, but it won't be complete until about the 1830s at the earliest. It had very little impact on main continental Europe until the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Now, why? Well, land geography. The geographic isolation from the continent offered protection and separation from many of the continental wars, allows England to have an upper hand. Also, England had a good supply of coal and iron. Wales and northern England were important sources, and foreign assistance was not required. The waterways offered a source to alternate power for factories and as navigable for trade and communication. In fact, no part of England was more than 20 miles from navigable water. And so the Industrial Revolution will grow out of England's expanding role in the Atlantic economy in the 18th century. The growth of the Royal Navy, the growth of the ports, provided protection from foreign invasion and later aided in Britain's commercial empire. In addition to this, the agricultural revolution was vital to the Industrial Revolution. The supply of cheap and abundant labor emerged as the enclosure movement forced many landless farmers to move to towns and cities. In other words, as the enclosure movement took place in the countryside, leading on the backs of the agricultural revolution that led to the enclosure movement, many of these former peasants now needed new jobs. They began to flood into these cities, and they found jobs in these factories, the beginnings of industrialization. So more people thus were free up to work in factories, or what we call the industrial proletariat, or in the distribution of goods and services. People were free to move around in search of land and other forms of employment rather than being tied to land as a serf. The result? Large supplies of capital were also available due to 2 centuries of profitable commercial activity. The Age of Exploration had brought a lot of money into the country. And now England is rolling in investment capital. They also avoided many of the continental wars that had subsumed the main part of Europe. British merchants and gentry had long prospered, despite the numerous wars on the continent. And, very importantly, in 1694, the establishment by the government of the Bank of England, a central bank, will be a huge boom because it allows investment capital to be used as startup for these factories, industrialization. In addition, insurance companies like Lloyd's of London will provide some degree of protection from commercial failure. These entrepreneurs are a class of highly motivated people who possess technological skill and were willing to take risks. Many young men from the gentry undertook careers in business. Members of the middle class could rise to the nobility ranks from the wealth created in their businesses. And Calvinists, the old Puritans, they were in that middle class driven by that Protestant work ethic. So, all of this is going to allow England to go first. And, to be clear, the government aided as well. The government was sympathetic to the industrial development, and well-established financial institutions were ready to make loans. Limited monarchy meant that government did not stifle growth and expansion of the middle class, as was the case in both France and Russia. The stable government, the success of outcome of wars did not leave England devastated, like was the case with most of continental Europe thanks to the Napoleonic Wars. The rise in the House of Commons became an instrument for the middle class to gain government cooperation and secured middle class loyalty. They will also pass a number of legislation by Parliament that will help facilitate the growth of industry, including the Bubble Act that will be repealed, which again allowed for joint stock companies and less monopolies. The Lowe's Act, which will allow for limited liability for business owners should something go awry. And the repeal of the Navigation Acts and Corn Laws that will decrease mercantilism, stifling effort in certain industries. The result? A growing demand of textiles is going to lead to the creation of the world's first large factories. The constant shortage of thread in the textile industry was focused on attention on ways of improving spinning. The inventions of the proto-industrialization that we talked about a few minutes ago will facilitate increased production of thread. The steam engine, by using the steam engine's application to textile production, was perhaps the key event in the Industrial Revolution. In the 1780s, Richard Arkwright used the steam engine to power looms and required factory production of textiles. By 1784, Edmund Cartwright invented the loom that powered by horses, water, or steam. Metallurgy industries flourished as they provided the machinery. And the results of other new technologies, or the result of all these new technologies was, by 1790, these new machines could produce as much as 10 times as much cotton yarn as they had in 1770. Let me repeat that. Within 20 years, from 1770 to 1790, they were producing 10 times as much cotton. By 1800, the production of cotton was England's most important industry. And by 1850, England produced more than half of the world's cotton cloth. And cotton was almost half of Britain's exports. Cotton goods became cheaper and were enjoyed by members of all classes of society. Even poor people could now afford to wear cotton slips and underwear. More invention: steam engines and coal. The use of coal to produce steam engines was one of the hallmarks of the Industrial Revolution. This revolution in energy involved the transition from wood burning to coal burning. Now, prior to 1780, processed wood, charcoal, was the fuel that was mixed with iron ore in the blast furnace to produce pig iron. Much of England, as well as other parts of Europe, were experiencing deforestation. Thus, we need to find a new source: coal. Coal provided steam power that was used in many industries. And by 1850, England produced 2/3 of the world's coal. Now, a little history of the steam engine. By 1698, Thomas Savery and Thomas Newcomen in 1705 invented the steam pump to pump water out of mines. Both engines were used inefficiently. Both engines were extremely inefficient. They were used, however, to replace the mechanical pumps pumped by water. So again, the issue is when you're digging in mines for coal, at some point you reach the water level and the mines begin to flood. You got to pump the water out. Up until the 1700s, essentially, they were using this animal-powered pump. The use of a steam pump would allow, much more water more quickly to be pumped out of mines. But the first two attempts by Thomas Savery and Thomas Newcomen were extremely inefficient. The real breakthrough came in 1769 when James Watt invented and patented the first efficient steam engine. By the late 1780s, the steam engine was now used regularly in production in England. The steam engine was the most fundamental advance in technology that is going to fuel the Industrial Revolution, that will create radical transformations that occur in both manufacturing and transportation. Because steam power would replace water power in the cotton spinning mills, as well as other mills including flour, malt, and flint. The iron industry was radically transformed by steam power as well. Rising supplies of coal boosted iron production and gave rise to heavy industry, the manufacture of machinery and materials used in production. Iron makers switched over rapidly from charcoal to coke in smelting the pig iron. In the 1780s, Henry Cort will develop the puddling furnace. You can see pictured on the screen. Cort developed a heavy-duty steam-powered rolling mills capable of finishing iron into any shape or form. And by 1850, England was producing half of the world's iron. Now, in addition to the industry part of it, this steam engine will also facilitate the rise of the transportation revolution. The transportation revolution was made possible by steam power. It was necessary to distribute finished goods as well as deliver raw materials to factories. New canal systems were built, including the Duke of Bridgewater, who will fund and design or commission new canals so that industries, including steel, coal, and railroad, will be able to interact with each other. Construction of hard surface roads will be pioneered by John McAdam that will help facilitate land travel. And then significantly in 1807, Robert Fulton, the steamboat, will travel up the Hudson River from New York to Albany in the United States. But what Robert Fulton did with the steamboat was combine the Watt and Boulton steam engine, making two-way river transportation possible and high seas transportation faster. And just in 30 years, in 1838, the first steamship will travel across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I'm kind of going through this a little bit quickly, but I cannot overestimate. I cannot undersell how important this development of the steamship is by Robert Fulton. Because now you don't have to rely on the winds, or you don't have to rely on just going downriver with the flow of water. No. Now you can travel both ways, and you can connect all parts of industry. You can also communicate better. You can transport raw materials. You can transport finished goods, and you can cut down rapidly the travel time across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting more markets for more people to sell more stuff. And then another big boom is the railroads. The first steam engine was used on the streets of London in 1803. By 1812, the steam wagon was adopted for use on rails. And by 1825, George Stephenson, there we go, the picture of George Stephenson right there, I'm sorry, he will make railway locomotive commercially successful. By the 1830s, the locomotive was traveling at more than 16 miles an hour, crisscrossing England. And the impact was immeasurable. It greatly reduced the cost of shipping freight on land, resulted in a growing regional and national market that spurred growth in industrial productivity to meet larger demand. It facilitated the growth of an urban working class who came from the countryside. Many cottage workers, farm laborers, and small peasants began building railroads. As rail lines were being built, many would travel on the railroads into towns looking for work. The result? By 1850, Britain produced 2/3 the world's coal, half the world's iron, half the world's cotton cloth. Their gross national product between 1801 and 1850 raised 350%. And likewise, correspondingly, their population increased from 9 million people in 1780 to almost 21 million people in 1851. This was all the result of the Industrial Revolution. Now we're going to stop here. We're going to come back for part 2 of this lecture next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.